The endless void of space stretched beyond the viewport, dark and unyielding, punctuated only by the distant glow of dying stars. Commander Elias Kane sat alone in his quarters aboard the UEA Erebus, staring at the worn insignia of the United Earth Alliance on the desk before him. The badge, scratched and dulled by years of battle, felt like a relic of a world that no longer existed. Humanity had once been a thriving force in the galaxy, but now it was a species on the brink, cornered by an enemy it could not comprehend. Kane's comm unit crackled, breaking the silence. "Commander," came the voice of Lieutenant Arden, his second in command. "You're needed on the bridge. We've intercepted a distress signal." A sigh escaped him. Every signal they'd responded to lately had ended the same way. Too late, too few survivors, and more evidence of the Onyx swarm's relentless advance. Yet he rose, tightening the collar of his uniform, and strode to the bridge. The doors slid open to reveal a scene of barely controlled chaos. Officers worked at their consoles, their faces pale, under the harsh glow of monitors displaying a distorted transmission. "Report," Kane ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. Arden stepped forward, a wiry man with a perpetual look of exhaustion. "We picked up a signal from the Pharaoh's colony, sir. They're under attack. Civilian ships are trying to evacuate, but they won't last long without cover." Kane's jaw tightened. Pharaoh's was one of humanity's last surviving colonies. Losing it would deal a catastrophic blow to morale and resources. He turned to the tactical officer. "Status on the swarm." "Multiple signatures converging on the colony, sir. At least 3 hive fleets," the officer replied grimly. "They'll be overwhelmed in minutes." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over the crew. Kane's mind raced. The Erebus was a formidable ship, armed with experimental weaponry and a skeleton crew of seasoned soldiers. But they were just one ship, and the swarm was an endless tide of destruction. Engaging the enemy could mean the destruction of the Erebus, humanity's last warship. Yet doing nothing would condemn thousands of lives to a brutal end. "We're going," Kane said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Plot a course for Pharaoh's. Maximum speed." Arden hesitated. "Sir, if we lose the Erebus, then humanity loses its last chance," Kane interrupted. "I'm not interested in what happens if we fail. I want solutions to make sure we don't." The crew snapped into action, spurred by his resolve. Kane moved to the command chair, his gaze fixed on the main display as the Erebus engines roared to life. The ship surged forward, a lone spear hurtling toward the heart of the storm. As the Erebus approached Pharaoh's, the scale of the swarm became horrifyingly clear. Hundreds of dark, insect-like ships swarmed the colony, their movements a synchronized dance of destruction. Civilians scrambled to escape, their ships tiny and fragile compared to the monstrous enemy. "Prepare for combat," Kane commanded, his voice cold steel. "We're the only hope they've got." And with that, the battle for Pharaoh's began. The moment the Erebus dropped out of hyperspace, the chaos of the battlefield erupted around them. Explosions rippled across the void as civilian transports zigzagged through space, desperate to escape the swarm's assault. The enemy ships, black and sleek like shards of obsidian, moved with a terrifying precision, surrounding their prey in a web of destruction. Commander Kane gripped the armrest of his chair. "Status report. Multiple swarm fleets detected." Lieutenant Arden shouted over the alarms. "Their numbers are overwhelming. At least 40 enemy vessels are converging on the colony's evacuation zone. Civilians are scattered and uncoordinated. Half their ships have no shields or weapons." Kane's jaw tightened. "Target the swarm clusters nearest the evac routes. We'll punch a hole for the transports to escape." "Aye, Commander," replied the weapons officer. At the tactical station, Lyra Solon, the alien strategist, narrowed her eyes at the holographic display. Her green skin glowed faintly in the dim light of the bridge. "Charging straight in won't work," she said, her voice sharp and analytical. "The swarm will adapt to our movements within minutes. We need to misdirect them. Kane turned his gaze toward her. What are you suggesting? Lyra stabbed a clawed finger at the map. Their hive-mind coordination relies on maintaining formation. If we disrupt their command patterns, it will buy the civilians enough time to escape. Hit them here and here. She marked 2 points on the display. Then fall back. Make them think we're retreating. It'll draw them away from the evac zone. Kane hesitated for only a moment. Do it. Tactical. Adjust our targeting to hit those clusters. Helm, prepare for evasive maneuvers after the strike. The crew moved with precision, the bridge humming with coordinated energy. The Erebus surged forward, its experimental railguns charging with a high-pitched whine. A volley of superheated projectiles tore through the first swarm formation, shredding their ships in a brilliant burst of light. The Erebus turned sharply, its thrusters blazing as it executed Lyra's feint. The swarm reacted instantly. Their ships broke formation, chasing the Erebus like a pack of wolves. Lyra's plan is working, Arden reported. The Avic ships are breaking through the blockade. Kane allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it was short-lived. Don't celebrate yet. They'll regroup faster than we expect. Tactical, how long until the swarm adapts to our pattern? 30 seconds, maybe less, Lyra said grimly. Kane's mind raced. Redirect power to the aft shields. Helm, take us into the debris field. The Erebus dove into the shattered remains of a civilian transport, weaving through the wreckage as the swarm ships pursued. The debris slowed the enemy, but not enough. Commander, incoming swarm bombers, Arden shouted. Fire on my mark, Kane barked, his voice like thunder. He waited until the bombers closed the gap, then gave the order. Mark. The Erebus unleashed a salvo of missiles, detonating the wreckage around them. The resulting shockwave ripped through the enemy formation, sending swarm ships careening into one another. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Kane silenced them with a raised hand. Stay focused. Get those civilians out of here. And someone give me an update on the colony's surface defenses. Arden's face darkened as he reviewed the reports. The swarm has breached the colony's perimeter. Ground forces are being overwhelmed. Kane's fists clenched. He had saved the evacuees, but the people still trapped on Pharaohs were as good as dead unless they acted fast. He turned to Lyra, his eyes blazing with determination. We're not leaving until we pull everyone we can off that rock. Prep the drop teams. This isn't over yet. As the Erebus veered toward the planet, Kane knew they were flying straight into the fire, but if the swarm wanted a fight, they would give them one to remember. The Erebus pierced the upper atmosphere of Pharaohs like a flaming sword, its hull glowing red-hot as it descended toward the embattled colony. Below, the surface was a nightmare of smoke and fire. The colony's defensive emplacements were barely holding, their automated turrets spraying streams of energy into the advancing swarm boards. On the ground, humanity's last soldiers fought desperately, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Commander Kane stood on the bridge, watching the chaotic scenes unfold on the tactical display. His fists clenched at the sight of human defenders being overrun by the insect-like creatures of the Onyx swarm. Status on the AVEC ships. Lieutenant Arden looked up from his console, his face grim. The last civilian transports have broken through the blockade and are heading to safety. But the swarm is diverting forces from orbit to focus on the surface. They're not leaving survivors. Kane nodded sharply. Then we go down. Prep the drop teams and get me a secure channel to the ground commander. As the Erebus leveled out, its hangar bays sprang to life. Dropships lined up in formation, their engines roaring. Soldiers in battle-worn armor filed aboard, their faces hardened by weeks of fighting and loss. Among them was Major Lania Vasquez, leader of the Erebus ground assault teams. Her voice crackled over the comms. All units ready. Just give the word, Commander. Kane opened a channel to the colony below. Static filled the bridge before a broken voice came through. This is Captain Moreau of Pharaoh's Ground Command. We're pinned at the central square. Civilians are sheltering in the lower levels, but we can't hold much longer. We need immediate support. You'll have it, Kane replied. Hold your position. We're coming in hot. Lyra Solon stepped forward, her green skin glinting in the dim light. If you're deploying forces to the ground, you'll need to divide the swarm's attention. I suggest deploying decoys to draw their ground units away from the evacuation routes. Kane nodded. Do it. Launch the decoys and have the railguns provide covering fire for the drop teams. The Erebus shuddered as its railguns unleashed a thunderous barrage, tearing into the swarm formations below. Decoy drones shot out from the ship, their energy signatures mimicking the presence of human soldiers. The swarm reacted instantly, breaking off to chase the false targets. Drop teams, you're clear, Kane ordered. The dropships launched in synchronized precision, streaking through the smoky sky like falling stars. Below, Captain Moreau and his battered troops watched as the ships descended, hope flickering in their exhausted eyes. The dropships touched down in the central square, their doors opening to unleash squads of heavily armed soldiers. Major Vasquez led the charge, her plasma rifle blazing as she gunned down a wave of swarm creatures. Secure the perimeter, she shouted. We hold this position until every civilian is out. From the bridge, Kane monitored the battle with steely focus. Arden, keep our shields at maximum. Lyra, track enemy reinforcements and relay updates to the ground teams. Lyra's voice was calm but urgent. The swarm is adapting to the decoys. Reinforcements are converging on the central square. Kane gritted his teeth. Vasquez, you've got incoming. Expect heavy resistance. Understood, Vasquez replied, her tone steady. We're not going anywhere until these people are safe. The ground shook as massive swarm creatures, towering monstrosities with chitinous armor, emerged from the smoke. The soldiers braced themselves, their weapons trained on the new threat. Above, the Erebus rained down precision strikes, buying precious seconds for the evacuation. Commander, Arden said, his voice tense, we got another wave of swarm ships inbound. If we don't pull out soon, we're going to be surrounded. Kane's gaze hardened. We stay until the last civilian is off that planet. I don't care what it takes. As the battle raged below and the skies above grew darker with enemy ships, Kane knew this was only the beginning. The Erebus had bought humanity a sliver of hope, but the fight for survival was far from over. The central square of Pharos was an inferno of chaos. Soldiers fought tooth and nail to repel the endless tide of swarm creatures, their weapons glowing red-hot from overuse. Civilians huddled in underground shelters, their desperate whispers drowned out by the roar of explosions and the bone-chilling shrieks of the alien invaders. Overhead, the Erebus loomed like a guardian angel, its railguns and missile batteries raining fire on the enemy below. Major Vasquez ducked behind a barricade as a massive swarm drone lunged at her position, its razor-sharp mandibles snapping inches from her face. She rolled to the side, raised her plasma rifle, and fired 3 shots into its head. The creature collapsed in a heap, but more were already swarming through the breach. Hold the line, Vasquez bellowed, her voice cutting through the cacophony. We've got civilians depending on us. Her soldiers responded with grim determination, their weapons spitting fire as they pushed back the onslaught. Despite their bravery, it was clear they were running out of time. On the Erebus, Commander Kane stood rigid, his hands gripping the railing of the command platform. The tactical display showed the grim reality. Enemy reinforcements were pouring in from all directions, both on the ground and in orbit. The swarm was throwing everything they had at Pharos, determined to annihilate any trace of human life. Lieutenant Arden glanced at Kane, his expression dark. Commander, the drop teams are reporting heavy casualties. We can't sustain this much longer. Kane's jaw tightened. What's the status of the evac? Civilians are still being loaded onto transports, Arden replied. But they need at least 10 more minutes to clear the shelters. We don't have 10 minutes, Lara Solon said from her station. Her sharp eyes scanned the holographic display, her voice cold and analytical. The swarm's orbital fleet is repositioning. If they cut us off, we'll be trapped. Kane turned to her, his expression unyielding. Suggestions. Lyra hesitated, then pointed to a cluster of swarm ships moving into formation. If we strike at their flank and destroy their command vessels, it might buy us enough time to finish the evacuation. But it'll leave the Erebus vulnerable. Kane didn't hesitate. Do it. Helm, plot an attack vector. Weapons, prepare all batteries for concentrated fire. Arden's eyes widened. Sir, if we expose ourselves like that— I'm aware of the risk, Lieutenant, Kane interrupted, his voice hard. But those people down there are out of options. And so are we. We make this work, or we die trying. On the ground, Vasquez's calm crackled to life. Major, this is Kane. We're drawing the swarm's orbital fleet away, but you need to expedite the evac. We won't be able to hold them off forever. Understood, Commander, Vasquez replied, wiping blood from her face. She turned to her troops. We're speeding this up. Get those people on the transports now. As the soldiers redoubled their efforts, the ground quaked beneath them. A massive swarm behemoth emerged from the smoke, its hulking frame towering over the battlefield. Its 4 glowing eyes locked onto the human defenders, and with an ear-splitting roar, it charged. Vasquez didn't flinch. Focus fire on that thing. Take it down. Above the planet, the Erebus launched a daring assault on the swarm's flank. Its railguns fired in rapid succession, tearing through enemy vessels with brutal efficiency. The ship weaved through the chaos, dodging plasma blasts and returning fire with relentless precision. Shields at 20%, Arden called out. Stay on target, Kane barked. Lyra, are we hitting the command vessels? 2 down, 1 remaining, Lyra replied. But we're running out of time. Kane's eyes narrowed as he stared at the tactical display. Then we make it count. All power to forward weapons. Fire everything we've got. The Erebus unleashed a devastating salvo, its missiles and railguns converging on the final command vessel. The explosion lit up the void, scattering the swarm fleet in disarray. On the ground, Vasquez watched as the alien creatures hesitated, their movements faltering. The swarm's coordination is breaking, she shouted. Push them back. As the soldiers rallied and the last civilians boarded the transports, Kane's voice came over the comm. Major, you're clear to extract. Get your teams back to the Erebus. We're pulling out. Vasquez nodded grimly. Understood, Commander. We're on our way. But as the dropships lifted off, the shadow of something far larger loomed on the horizon. A new swarm mothership, its size eclipsing anything they'd seen before. Kane's heart sank as he realized the battle was far from over. The dropships rocketed upward, carrying the battered ground teams and the last of the civilians toward the Erebus. Below, the colony of Pharaohs was a smoldering ruin, engulfed in flames and shrouded in ash. The defenders had done the impossible, delayed the swarm long enough for the evacuation to succeed. But as the shadow of the swarm mothership stretched across the battlefield, the fleeting sense of victory was eclipsed by dread. On the bridge of the Erebus, alarm screamed as sensors locked onto the colossal vessel. It dwarfed the human warship, its organic hull bristling with jagged, spiked protrusions that glowed with ominous green energy. The swarm mothership exuded an overwhelming aura of malice, as though it were the physical embodiment of the Hive's will. Lieutenant Arden's voice trembled as he read the data flooding his console. Commander, the mothership's power readings are off the scale. It's arming a superweapon, something big. How long until it's ready to fire? Kane demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. 5 minutes, maybe less, Arden replied. Kane clenched his fists, his mind racing. The colony was gone, but the evacuation transports were still within the system, vulnerable to an attack of this magnitude. If the swarm fired that weapon, thousands of lives would be wiped out in an instant. Lyra, Kane barked. turning to the alien strategist. What are our options? Lyra's green skin glowed faintly as she analyzed the tactical display. That weapon will destroy everything within range, including us. Our only chance is to disable it before it fires. The mothership's core is its weak point, but it's buried deep within its structure. A direct strike would require us to penetrate their defenses and risk a close-quarters engagement. Arden's head snapped toward her. That's a suicide mission. Not if we're fast enough, Lyra replied coldly. But it's the only way. Kane didn't hesitate. We've come this far. We're not running now. Helm, plot an intercept course for the mothership. Arden, prepare the railguns and missile batteries. Lyra, coordinate with engineering to maximize shield output. We'll need every ounce of power we've got. The crew sprang into action, their fear tempered by the unyielding resolve in Kane's voice. The Erebus turned toward the mothership, its engines roaring as it charged headlong into the jaws of the beast. The Erebus entered the mothership's defensive perimeter, its weapons firing in relentless volleys. Swarm frigates and fighters swarmed toward them, but the warship's advanced targeting systems picked them off with brutal precision. Inside the Erebus, the deck shuddered with every hit, but the crew held firm. Shields at 15%. Arden reported, sweat dripping from his brow. Hold the line, Kane shouted. Lyra, how close are we to the core? Lyra's eyes scanned the data. Another 3 kilometers. We'll need to breach the outer hull to get a clear shot. Kane's jaw tightened. Helm, take us in. Tactical, prepare the main railgun for a precision strike. This has to count. As the Erebus drew closer, the swarm mothership began to react. Massive organic cannons on its surface swiveled to track the human warship, firing streams of plasma that lit up the void. One shot grazed the Erebus hull, sending sparks flying across the bridge. Structural integrity is failing, Arden warned. Just a little longer, Kane muttered. Lyra, target the core. I have it. Lyra said. Coordinates locked. Fire, Kane bellowed. The Erebus unleashed a single devastating shot from its main railgun. The projectile tore through the mothership's hull, carving a path of destruction that reached deep into its core. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, the mothership began to collapse, its massive structure crumbling inward as explosions rippled across its surface. Cheers erupted on the Erebus bridge, but Kane's focus remained unbroken. Status on the transports. They're clear of the blast radius, Arden confirmed, his relief palpable. The Erebus pulled away from the disintegrating mothership, its engines struggling under the strain. As the crew began to assess the damage, Kane allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. They had survived the impossible, but the cost had been staggering. This isn't over, Kane said quietly, his gaze fixed on the burning remains of Pharaohs. The swarm will be back, and next time, they'll hit us even harder. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady, but tinged with an uncharacteristic hint of respect. Then we'll be ready. As the Erebus limped away from the battlefield, its crew battered but unbroken, the fight for humanity's survival entered a new and uncertain chapter. The war wasn't won, but for now, they had earned the right to fight another day. The Erebus drifted in deep space, its engines barely functioning after the brutal assault on the swarm mothership. The massive warship limped away from the battlefield, its hull scorched and battered, but intact. For now, the immediate threat was gone, but Kane knew better than to rest easy. The swarm would return. It always did. The bridge was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense silence. Officers worked diligently at their stations, their faces pale from exhaustion, but the weariness in their eyes spoke volumes. They had won a battle, but the war, that was far from certain. Kane stood at the command platform, staring at the starfield ahead, lost in thought. Behind him, Arden approached, his face haggard but determined. Commander, Arden said quietly, "We've managed to stabilize the ship's systems, but we've lost half the crew. I don't think we can hold off another attack like that for long." Kane nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know. We need to make repairs, but more importantly, we need to rethink our strategy. The swarm isn't just a fleet. We're dealing with a whole civilization, a network of hive minds that adapt faster than we can fight. They've been at this for centuries." Lyra Solon entered the bridge, her green eyes sharp and calculating. She approached Kane with her usual quiet grace, but there was a weight to her words. "The swarm will not relent. We have bought time, yes, but they will reorganize, regroup, and return with a vengeance. Their hive mind will evolve. We must change our tactics if we are to have any hope of surviving the next wave." Kane turned to face her. "And what do you propose? We can't just keep throwing ourselves at them." Lyra hesitated before speaking again, her gaze intense. "We have to target their source, the center of the swarm's operations, their homeworld." Arden's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You want to go to their homeworld? That's madness. We don't even know where it is, let alone how to infiltrate it." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "I know the location. It's not something I have learned from my people. It is something I have uncovered from my time with the swarm. There is a planet, deep in the heart of their territory, where their hive mind is strongest. It's a place they call the Nexus. If we can strike at the heart of their network, we can cripple them." Kane studied her for a long moment. "And what makes you think this is possible? What if it's a trap? We don't know what we're walking into." Lyra met his gaze unflinchingly. "I would not propose this if I did not believe it to be our only chance. The swarm's central consciousness is vulnerable there. The destruction of the Nexus will cause them to fragment, scatter into disconnected cells. It is a dangerous mission, yes, but it is our only chance to win this war." Kane paced in silence for a long moment, weighing the risks. The loss of the Erebus and its crew could mean the loss of humanity's last hope. But their other options were running out. The swarm's relentless assault had already claimed countless worlds, and the survival of the human race depended on stopping them now. "We do it," Kane said finally, his voice resolute. "We'll find the Nexus and destroy it. Arden, get me a course. Lyra, I'll need your full cooperation on this. We're going to need all the intel we can get." As the Erebus prepared to embark on its most dangerous mission yet, the crew gathered in the mess hall, their faces filled with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Despite the weight of the task ahead, there was a strange sense of unity, an understanding that this was their last shot. Vasquez approached Kane, her face drawn but unwavering. "Commander, I don't need to tell you that this mission is suicide, but I'll follow you to the ends of the galaxy, if that's what it takes." Kane looked at her, meeting her gaze. "We all knew what we signed up for. But if we do this, we're not just saving humanity. We're showing the swarm that they made a mistake underestimating us." Vasquez nodded, the fierce resolve in her eyes a reflection of the entire crew. "Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget." The Erebus lifted off from its temporary station, its engines sputtering but holding steady. The warship set a course for the deepest, most dangerous reaches of swarm space, the heart of the enemy's power. Kane stared at the stars ahead, knowing the path would lead to either humanity's salvation or its final bloody end. The stars stretched out before the Erebus, vast and cold. As the ship traversed deeper into swarm territory, the bridge fell into an eerie silence. Every crew member knew what lay ahead, the heart of the enemy's hive mind, the Nexus, and with it, the weight of humanity's survival. Kane stood at the command platform, eyes fixed on the view screen. Arden and Lyra stood beside him, each absorbed in their own tasks. The tension in the air was palpable, but Kane couldn't afford to let his team falter. The fate of the entire human race rested on the success of this mission. "Commander," Arden said, breaking the silence, "we've entered the outermost perimeter of their territory. I'm reading multiple swarm vessels on long-range scans. They're not approaching, but it's only a matter of time before they notice us. Kane didn't flinch. We expected this. Lyra, how much farther to the Nexus? Lyra's voice was steady, her alien calm unwavering. We are 30 hours away, Commander. But we must remain undetected if we are to succeed. The Nexus is heavily fortified, and any signs of our approach will alert the swarm to our presence. Kane nodded. All right. We'll use the last of our cloaking technology to remain hidden. Any sign of them getting too close, and we'll have to engage. Arden, can we boost our shields? We're running low on power from the last engagement, but I can push them for a short burst. Arden replied, his voice tinged with urgency. It'll take everything we've got, but it'll keep us undetected long enough to reach the Nexus. Do it, Kane ordered, the words feeling like a weight on his shoulders. They were playing with fire, but there was no choice. They had to make it. Hours turned into a tense silence as the Erebus crept through swarm space. The crew worked in near-perfect synchronization, every motion precise, every calculation carefully measured. Yet even as they approached their goal, there was a growing sense of unease. They were no longer fighting to survive. They were hunting a living, breathing nightmare. As they neared the Nexus, Lyra's expression tightened. We're close. The swarm's neural network is like a vast web here. The Nexus is not just a planet. It's a concentration of their collective consciousness. If we strike too early or too late, we risk alerting them to our presence. Then we need to move fast, Kane said. The longer we wait, the more time they have to prepare. The view screen displayed the dark outline of a massive planet, surrounded by dense clusters of swarm ships. The atmosphere above the surface churned, alive with strange energy fields and disturbing waves of plasma. It was a planet that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, a place that seemed to breathe. We've made it, Lyra whispered, almost reverently. The Nexus. But as the Erebus closed in on the planet, an alarm suddenly blared across the bridge. Commander, Arden shouted. Multiple swarm vessels. Too many for us to fight. They've detected us. Kane's heart raced as the tactical screen lit up with dozens of incoming ships. He cursed under his breath. What happened to our cloak? Arden's face was ashen. We pushed the shields too far. The cloaking device malfunctioned. Our position is compromised. Kane's mind raced. They had no choice but to fight. He turned to the crew, his voice firm. Prepare for combat. All hands to battle stations. Lyra, I need a way to disrupt their communication networks. We can't afford to let them coordinate. Lyra's eyes narrowed. I can use the ship's sensors to create a pulse that will scramble their signals. It won't stop them, but it should disorient them long enough to buy us time. Do it, Kane ordered. Arden, brace for impact. We're going in hot. The Erebus shuddered as enemy fire began to rain down. The warship's shields flared under the intensity of the incoming blasts, but they held. Arden was quick to adjust, returning fire with the Erebus, cannons and railguns, taking out several smaller swarm ships. But the numbers were overwhelming. Firing on all targets, the weapons officer shouted as the ship's guns fired in rapid succession. The Erebus danced through the firestorm, weaving between enemy ships as they closed in from all directions. The crew worked in perfect harmony, but the pressure was mounting. The swarm wasn't just attacking. They were trying to force the Erebus into a trap. They're coming from all sides. Arden yelled. Stay focused, Kane said, his voice unwavering. We hold this line until we reach the planet's surface. Get us through the blockade. We need to hit the Nexus before it's too late. Lyra tapped her console, sending a pulse of energy across the battlefield, scrambling the swarm's communications. For a brief moment, the enemy ships hesitated, confused by the sudden disruption. It's working, Lyra said. They're losing coordination. Now, move in, Kane barked. Full speed ahead. We're not letting them regroup. With renewed determination, The Erebus pushed forward, charging toward the Nexus. The odds were stacked against them, but Kane knew one thing. This was their last chance. They were going to make it, or they were going to die trying. The Erebus cut through the swarm blockade like a blade through flesh, its weapons tearing into the enemy vessels as the ship surged toward the surface of the Nexus. Every second was a battle, every minute a desperate race against the swarm's overwhelming numbers. The bridge was a hive of frantic activity, the air thick with tension as the crew fought to keep the ship intact and the mission on course. Shields at 20%. Arden shouted, his hands flying across the controls as the ship's systems strained under the weight of the relentless enemy assault. We're almost there. Kane's voice was sharp, his eyes fixed on the view ahead. The planet loomed large on the view screen, its surface scarred by the pulses of the swarm's energy fields. The Nexus was no longer just a planet. It had become a living fortress, a heart beating with the power of 1,000 hives. We can't keep this up much longer, Arden warned. If we don't break through soon, we'll be sitting ducks. Kane's eyes narrowed. We don't have a choice. All we need is a window, just a few seconds. We're going in. Lyra, who had been focused on the sensors, turned to him with a look of grim determination. I'm ready to initiate the breach. But once we do, it's no turning back. The Nexus will fight us every step of the way. Kane nodded. We don't have time for second guesses. Let's end this. With a final burst of energy, the Erebus plunged through the remaining swarm defenses and broke through the planet's atmosphere. The ship shook violently as it passed through the energy fields, every system screaming under the strain. But it held. As they neared the surface, the heart of the Nexus appeared in all its terrifying grandeur. A massive glowing structure at the center of the planet, an ancient and alien construct that pulsed with unimaginable power. The hive mind of the swarm was anchored there, its neural network branching out from the structure like a vast, living organism. We're approaching the core, Lyra said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Once we breach the surface, we'll have mere moments before the Nexus begins to react. We've got one shot, Kane said, his voice cold as steel. Let's make it count. The Erebus landed hard, its massive bulk skidding across the surface of the Nexus, sending clouds of alien dust and debris into the air. The crew barely had time to steady themselves before the ship's hull began to groan under the pressure of incoming enemy fire. The swarm had not given up, and they were coming. Fast. Prepare for ground assault, Kane ordered. All personnel, suit up and deploy. We hit the Nexus hard and fast. No hesitation. In the hangar bay, the crew donned their battle gear, their faces determined. They knew the odds, but they were humanity's last chance. They had fought this far, and now it was time to finish the fight. The team stormed out of the Erebus, weapons raised, as the surface of the Nexus erupted in a hail of gunfire and explosions. The ground shook beneath their feet as massive alien creatures, spawned from the Nexus itself, charged forward to meet them. The battle was brutal, ferocious, nothing like they had ever faced before. Every step forward was a fight for survival. Kane led the charge, cutting through swarm forces with ruthless precision. His soldiers followed, their determination unbreakable, their fear swallowed by the fire of resolve. Lyra, get to the core, Kane shouted over the din of battle. We need to reach the heart before the swarm can react. Lyra nodded sharply, her alien agility allowing her to slip through the chaos with ease. She moved toward the Nexus central chamber, where the neural core of the hive mind pulsed with raw energy, its tendrils reaching out to the stars above. The entire Nexus seemed to be alive. Its walls were shifting, its surface trembling with the power of the hive. Arden and Vasquez covered Lyra's back as they made their way deeper into the heart of the Nexus. Every step was met with resistance, every corner revealing new horrors from the depths of the swarm's nightmare. But they were undeterred. They had come this far. Finally, they'd reached the central chamber. The core of the Nexus stood before them, a glowing orb of energy surrounded by intricate alien structures. Lyra approached it slowly, her breath steady despite the chaos outside. "It's time," she said, her voice calm and focused. "We destroy it now." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the core. The Nexus reacted immediately. Its tendrils lashed out, and the ground trembled violently. The ship shook. The atmosphere itself seemed to crack under the pressure of the unleashed power. Kane's voice echoed in the comms. "Do it, Lyra. Now." With a swift motion, Lyra activated the device. The core erupted in a blinding flash of energy. The entire Nexus screamed in pain as the hive mind collapsed in on itself, its neural network fragmenting and splintering into chaos. The swarm's grip on the galaxy was shattered. The force of the explosion sent shockwaves across the planet, and the Erebus was rocked violently as it began to lift off. But Kane knew this battle was over. The war was won. As they ascended, the planet began to crumble, its surface imploding as the heart of the Nexus burned out. In the distance, the remaining swarm forces scattered, their unity fractured beyond repair. The war was far from over, but the human race had done the impossible. They had struck at the heart of the swarm and survived. And in the silence that followed the destruction, Kane allowed himself one fleeting moment of hope. They had won, but it was only the beginning of humanity's new fight for survival.